Pravit Moy Druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to help you have some context about what's going on in the war in Ukraine. So at this point, it's Friday, May 5th. We're still trying to figure out what's going on with the drone attack on Moscow. It's clearly not an assassination attempt, or it would be the worst assassination attempt ever in history. But something's going on here, and we're trying to understand it. I'm going to review a number of articles, and I'll show you a little video and just try to make sense of what's going on here. So we're going to start with the Guardian. And the Guardian had this interesting article. The Kremlin drones certainly don't look like a cunning plan by Moscow. Okay, that runs counter to the narrative that I'm generally seeing. Most of you seem to think that it was a false flag operation, 64%. Partisans near the Kremlin seems to be the runner-up. Now, this is not an official poll, but once you get over about 300, you have something, generally speaking. And I would imagine that if Jake Bro or Vlad Vexler or somebody else did this on their channel, they'll probably have essentially the same kind of results. So that seems to be the leading theory, but here's what The Guardian had to say. Who exactly flew Chu drones over the Kremlin? They couldn't tell. It said, nor is it obvious that Russia needs an excuse for escalating the war when it has ratcheted up its own bombing in the last week amid fears that Ukraine's air defenses are running low. No, they do need an excuse. So here's the thing. Putin only has but so many cards left to play. Now that's the real insight here. He talks about nuclear saber rattling periodically, but he's starting to sound like the boy that cried wolf. But here he has a new card because now he has a new offense. He can rally people and say, this was wrong, this was an assassination attempt. And now whatever he decides to do to retaliate, it's not a terror campaign against civilians, it's retaliation for this great offense. So yeah, it does change things. Even Margarita Simonin, head of the broadcaster RT, no stranger to demanding that Russia bomb the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky in his palace, expressed reservations. If it was, quote, a cunning plan by Moscow, unquote, she said, quote, the situation would look very different by now, unquote. Now, I don't know that it would. I mean, I think that while they propagandize quite a bit, they're kind of not that great about it in some regards. Okay. However, Ukrainian sources close to the partisan operations say that they believe that drones were piloted remotely, not on a preset course. This means that they would have to be controlled from a secret location inside Russia itself, perhaps a few dozen miles from the capital, navigating using the ground to try to evade jamming. If true, that would be risky, but it would give a greater degree of control to those running the mission, and the Kremlin is an identifiable enough landmark to anyone who has studied the view from above. Some Russian bloggers speculate that the drones came from the east. That's like Sukumayas said that yesterday, giving extra credence to the theory. Now, to bolster the partisan theory, you want to hear this on CNN. A viewer passed this along to me yesterday, and I thought this was absolutely fascinating.
Up front now, Ilya Ponomarev. He is a former Russian lawmaker who was forced into exile after he became the only Russian lawmaker to vote against the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. So as I mentioned, you told Matthew that you believe the drone attack on the Kremlin was the work of Russian partisans. Why do you believe that?
Good evening. I just don't simply believe it. I know it as a fact. I know the people who actually produced those drones. Those drones were self-made. They were not factory manufactured. We are discussing that they had plans to attack Red Square on the 9th of May, but since this day is very special for the hearts of Russians and their Russians themselves, they were thinking that maybe it would be better to make a warning strike to make Vladimir Putin to cancel the military parade on the 9th of May altogether.
So you talked to them directly? Is that what you're saying, that you discussed this with them?
Yes.
Matthew, as you just heard there, I just mentioned other drone strikes in Russia. Do you think Russian partisans are behind those too?
No, there are different attacks, because there are attacks that have military meaning. and the attacks on the oil refineries or oil storages that were happening next to Ukrainian border. At least most of them, for sure, are the attacks that were carried out by Ukrainian security forces who are preparing for the offensive, and they are cutting off the supplies of the military goods and the fuel and everything related. By the way, the first attack on one of the refineries that were affected recently, Novoshakhtinsk refinery, was done by Russian partisans from Rostov region, and at that time it was a big scandal, and there was even Washington guys calling the office of the president in Ukraine, complaining that they promised not to attack Russian territory. And
Isn't that interesting that the U.S. was trying to rein it in, contrary to what Peskov was saying about, well, it's coming out of the U.S., and we know that the U.S. is the master manipulator and that kind of thing. So that's a pretty interesting point.
A year ago, and at that time, Ukrainian officials even turned to me and was asking whether it was indeed Russian partisans or not, and I was like giving them information about this. But this time, it's about the offensive. But what's happening in Moscow, for sure, it's not Ukrainians, and it's out of range. The reason why anti-missile defense of Russia did not intercept those drones were because those drones were launched right next to Moscow.
And that seems to be a pretty powerful argument for Zelensky saying, look, it wasn't us. It's out of range. Russian drones would have, or Russian technology would have intercepted it if it had come from Ukraine. So, but if it came from right next to Moscow, as he just said, it could be either of these two scenarios. Of it could be a false flag, or it could be Russian partisans.
What do you think the real impact of this attack on Putin was? If it is in fact these Russian partisans, as you say, do you think their objective was achieved here?
We'll see on the 9th of May. Obviously, the security measures in Moscow would be tightened, and I hope that the Russian authorities would make the right decision to downsize the military parade. At the end of the day, the objective was to demonstrate to Russians.
That's kind of too bad, because I was looking forward to the 9th of May, to the parade, to see just what tanks they actually had to trot out.
That the war, indeed, as you correctly said, is at home. And it's no longer somewhere there, and everybody has to take a side and to make this decision. It cannot just sit on the couch and watch the TV, looking whether ours are winning or somebody else's are winning. That's the real war.
You know, Russia touts its security often and its ability to protect Putin. Do you think that this is embarrassing to Putin?
No, I don't think there was any immediate threat to Vladimir Putin, because it was indeed it was a very light.
It wasn't an assassination. It was sending a message if it was partisans.
The dome of one of Kremlin's buildings that cannot affect Vladimir Putin even theoretically, even if he were in that particular building, he would not be effective. It's right now his propaganda statements that it was an assassination attempt. Obviously, it was just a symbolic act that was targeted to show that the parade could be affected, and it would be even bigger embarrassment if some drones would land at the Red Square on the very 9th of May, when all this military equipment, glorious military equipment of Russia, would be demonstrated there.
So that's the perspective of it was a partisan attack. Now, another view comes from the ISW, and the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, is an incredibly trustworthy source. Here's what they had to say yesterday. Russia accused Ukraine of conducting a drone strike against the Kremlin on May 3rd. Social media footage circulated on May 3rd shows a drone detonating near a flagpole on top of the Kremlin Senate Palace building in Moscow. The Kremlin accused Ukraine of orchestrating a planned terrorist attack. Okay, next week I'm going to do a video, because I just decided just now. on definitions, because it wasn't a terrorist attack. It is not a assassination attempt, and we have to use our words properly. This is just driving me absolutely crazy. With the intent of assassinating Russian President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky stressed that Ukraine did not conduct the attack. Now, just that he went so out of his way to say we didn't do it signals to me that Ukraine didn't do it, because what Ukraine normally does is they either take credit for the incident or they stay silent, but they don't deny, and then it's later proven out that they, generally speaking, this could be disinformation, but I don't think so. Okay, Russia likely staged this attack in an attempt to bring the war home to a Russian domestic audience and set conditions for a wider societal mobilization. Now, if that's true, that's really interesting, and it also verifies something that Anders Puck-Nielsen was talking about how Putin is trying to get people more politically interested or inclined, and then into three buckets. And let me review something that he talked about.
But now that the war drags out, this has become unsustainable. Like, Russia is losing so many soldiers that it will be impossible to isolate the broader Russian population from the fighting. Like, they can't just keep mobilizing soldiers from Siberia or the Caucasus. Like, eventually they will also have to take people from Moscow and St. Petersburg. So suddenly Putin is in a situation where he needs the Russian population not to be disengaged anymore.
Okay, and so that's what his theme is here. And he goes on, and I'll post the link to the whole video below so that you can see this. But he goes on, and a little bit further, he talks about this. This is his chart. He talks about you have politically disengaged people, and you want to get them above this threshold for political engagement. But when they start becoming politically engaged, they might become Putin supporters, or they might become ultra-nationalists like Igor Gherkin or something along those lines, the mill bloggers, or they might become part of the anti-war movement. And Putin wants them here, maybe even here, but he certainly doesn't want them there. Okay.
Now, what better way to get people to become, to fall into this bucket or this bucket than an attack, a false flag attack, as long as they don't know it's a false flag, an attack on the nation's capital. I remember at 9/11 how I felt, how I felt punched in the gut, and I was nowhere near what was going on there, but I still felt and identified with my country. So I think there might be something to that effect that Putin's trying to emulate. Now, let's go back to the ISW. So Russia likely staged this attack in an attempt to bring the war home to the Russian domestic audience and set conditions for a wider societal mobilization. Several indicators suggest that the strike was internally conducted and purposefully staged. Extremely unlikely that two drones could have penetrated multiple layers of air defense and detonated or been shot down just over the heart of the Kremlin in a way that provided spectacular imagery caught nicely on camera. Geolocated imagery, their authorities have been placing Pantsir air defense systems near Moscow to create air defense circles. You can see that here in this Twitter on Geo Confirmed. Yep, these are the one-year Pantsir in two defensive circles around Moscow, here and here. Right, so there's a reason that these are existing, and yeah, it's hard to believe that something coming from the territory of Ukraine could have gotten there. So it might be there's something that was local, that was just close enough, or maybe it was a false flag. Strike that avoided detection and destruction by such air defense, succeeding in hitting such a high-profile target as the Kremlin Senate Palace would be a significant embarrassment for Russia. The Kremlin's immediate, coherent, and coordinated response to the incident suggests that the attack was internally prepared in such a way that its intended political effects outweigh the embarrassment, right? So they've been inept at articulating things before when something caught them off guard, but they were on message with this one. If the drone attack had not been internally staged, it would have been a surprise event. It's very likely that the official Russian response would initially have been much more disorganized as Russian officials scrambled to create a coherent narrative. The rapid and coherent presentation of an official Russian narrative around the strike suggests that Russia staged this incident in close proximity to the May 9th Victory Day parade. in order to frame the war as an existential to its domestic audience. And again, what it would be doing is moving people from politically disengaged into the Putin supporter bucket. So I'm warming to Anders' argument here. But Vlad Vexler said the opposite, that whatever happens will cause politically disengaged to be even more politically disengaged. But I don't know, something that can arouse patriotism might actually do what Anders was talking about. Some Russian nationalist mill bloggers seized on the Kremlin drone strike to call for Russian escalation in the war, despite the fact that Russia currently lacks the military capability to do so. And they called for Russia to escalate in response, including by targeting President Volodymyr Zelensky and other Ukrainian decision makers. And I'll show you a clip of that kind of state media propaganda in just a moment. In the meantime, I want to turn my attention to Constantine. A number of you said, hey, have you seen Constantine's page on Inside Russia? Okay, so some of you like Constantine. I'm in that camp because he provides me insight. And some of you don't like him and say, well, he's a shill, he's a grifter, whatever. Okay, just process this and see if anything makes sense. Why silence for 12 hours? The attack happened on May 3rd at 2:22 or 2:27 a.m. and the second at 2:43 a.m. The first official message about the attack was released at 2:35 p.m. So 12 hours later is when the first message was released. Waiting for 12 hours? Why? Remember 9/11? Imagine if the American government was silent about the attack until 12 hours after. Number two, the attack theory is impossible to execute by an outsider without special knowledge or special help. Let me tell you a thing or two about the surroundings of the Kremlin. It's a radio wave dead zone. Mobile internet does not work there. That dead space was created for, you guessed it, that's right, so the drones would not fly over the Kremlin. Okay. Number three, who benefits? Definitely not the Ukrainians. It's be like poking a bear with rabies with a small needle. What a great picture. Now, for Russian government, it's a completely different story. Then can give an excuse to the Russians for escalating the bombing Ukraine. They can cause more fear with regular people. They can announce the start of a domestic terror campaign looking for domestic enemies. Too many benefits to mention here. Like, so inside Russia, they can clamp down even harder as well, just to, take precautions. Who launched the drones? Let me tell you another thing of the area surrounding the Kremlin. It's 100% surveilled, the safest area in Russia. Secret agents on the ground dressed as tourists everywhere. Why at night? Well, there's no one at the Kremlin at night, certainly not Putin. Why assassination attempt? The Russian propaganda called the attack Putin's assassination attempt, but why? Well, again, they're trying to make some hay out of this. And it's happened before. The Russian government has a very extensive experience in executing false flag attacks. Remember Finland, 1939. Remember Afghanistan, 1979. Remember Russia, 1999. I think he's talking about Chechnya there. Okay, that's Constantine's take. Now I also want to look at official Russian propaganda. Kremlin, this is Pravda, RU. Kremlin, Washington makes ridiculous attempts to disavow involvement in drone attacks. Well, but Washington didn't have involvement. And of course that doesn't stop Dmitry Peskov from claiming that they do.
We know very well that decisions about such actions, about such terrorist attacks, are made not in Kyiv, but in Washington. And Kyiv does what it is told to do.
There's a word that comes to mind that I'm obviously not appropriate.
But U.S. officials are pushing back.
Mr. Peskov's lying. I mean, that's obviously, it's a ludicrous claim. The United States had nothing to do with this. We don't even know exactly what happened here, Caitlin, but I can assure you the United States had no role in it whatsoever. I know there's lots of questions, but we just don't have conclusive evidence. One thing I can tell you for certain is that the United States was not involved in this incident in any way, contrary to Mr. Peskov's lies. And that's what they are, just lies.
Here's RT. The West is fueling Kyiv's sense of impunity, says Moscow. Kyiv's sense of impunity? What happened to Russia's sense of impunity after 2004 and 2008 and 2014 and what they've just done in 2022? U.S. presidential candidate condemns the Kremlin drone attack. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He's a a Democrat running for president. He's the nephew of JFK, the son of RFK. Robert Kennedy Jr. on Thursday denounced the drone attack as targeting the Kremlin, which Moscow has blamed on Washington. The Democrat challenging President Joe Biden for the presidential nomination also reminded Americans how his uncle helped prevent nuclear war in the USSR. And Kennedy has gone on and called for peace talks with Russia and other things along those lines, if you're not aware of who RFK Jr. is. Washington is responsible for the attack on the Kremlin, says Moscow. Well, yeah, they say a lot of things. The spokesperson for Vladimir Putin dismissed attempts by the U.S. and Ukrainian officials to disown Wednesday's attack as laughable, insisting, quote, "We know full well that decisions to carry out such terrorist actions are made not in Kyiv, but in Washington." Well, I mean, without some proof, you shouldn't be saying it, but again, that doesn't stop them. And finally, the U.S. lacks guts to condemn the drone attack on the Kremlin. Now, if we were convinced that it was an actual, terrorist attack, if it was an actual assassination attempt, unprovoked or something along those lines, maybe something would change. But that's not what it appears to be. So that's where we are. So he goes on and says, "We hope that the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden would have had the guts and dignity to condemn this terrorist attack." So look at the circumstances, though. One, we're not going to condemn Ukraine fighting back with its own armaments in light of what you have done to Ukraine. Two, it looks like a false flag attack, potentially, or maybe domestic partisans. I understand when you'd say, how would Americans react if the drone hit the White House or the Capitol or the Pentagon? But with 9/11, we weren't at war with Afghanistan. That was a very different circumstance. This is the middle of a war. And if you go across the border of a sovereign country with 190,000 troops intending to lop off, decapitate their government and take over their territory, this kind of thing happens. So, okay. So that's what I wanted to show you here so that you have a broader sense of this. I'll keep scouring the news to try to help you understand. But it looks like, look, there's two leading theories. The first leading theory is that it was a false flag operation. That's the ISW and others. And that seems to be the majority position. And then the second theory is that it was domestic partisans somewhere close to the Kremlin itself. Okay, so that's all that I have right now. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and thank you for caring about Ukraine.